molts anys que es dediquen a l'estudi de la relació entre llengua i economia i llengua. Cosa que, per exemple, a Catalunya, al nostre país, a l'àrea lingüística no n'hi ha gaires. Sempre és una cosa que ens lamentem. Doncs ell a Quebec, fa molts anys que estudia aquestes relacions, i l'altra cosa curiosa és que ell ve a Barcelona sovint, normalment invitat per la part econòmica, diríem. Com que ell és expert també en qüestions econòmiques, moltes vegades, doncs, diguem, ell s'ofereix de la conferència aquí, per les qüestions de la llengua, llavors jo l'acompanyo a baix i a baix l'espera algú de la Conselleria d'Economia o de l'Institut d'Economia de no sé què. És una persona realment, per tant, interdisciplinària, cosa que ens fa molt bé per entendre el món contemporani. Avui ens oferirà les últimes dades de les seves investigacions i en el col·loqui també tindrem ocasió segurament de parlar dels canvis que s'està produint a Quebec contemporàniament, perquè sembla que hi ha un moviment de reforma legislativa respecte de l'organització lingüística. Encara no està això implementat, però ja els partits estan negociant tot això i veurem a veure quines dades noves ens porta. François, allez-y.
Merci. We will do this in English. So, I've worked on the economics of language since 1974. It was my PhD thesis. Some of you may know the name of François in Geneva. I actually preceded, which is why my beard is gray. François did his postdoctoral with me. He began his research on economics of language in 1990 in Montreal. So, in general, ceded the field to him, but I'm still happy to talk about Quebec, which I still know a bit more than he does. And since I was coming to Barcelona, I have a couple of rules when I come to Spain. My wife loves Spain. I was happy to come back. So we went to Madrid. And if I go to Zaragoza, I email Julio Laborda, who's an economist, and I say, I'm there, you need something. So I actually gave a talk Friday on the economics of secession. People in Aragon are more excited about secession of Catalonia than people in Madrid. People in Madrid, I gave the same talk in Madrid. People in Madrid are a bit more dispassionate. But if I come to Barcelona, I always worry Professor Pastadas. Sometimes he says, no, it is not good, there's no student, there's nobody around, it's not worth you coming. That's fine. But I cannot imagine coming to Barcelona without writing a book. This is why I'm here today. So, a bit of background on Quebec, and a bit of background on economics of language, and what I thought was interesting, things that you can do with those tools that may give one of you one idea perhaps. And throughout the presentation, any question, just raise your hand. Just accept the answer. This is coming in the next slide. Okay, sometimes that will be true. And if it's not true, remind me. Okay, but just raise your hand. There's no point waiting to the end to get clarification on the second slide. I find that personally extremely frustrating. So, the outline, a bit of background, economics of language, language policy, some evidence on costs and benefits. And the fact is that there's always a language policy. It's either explicit or implicit. As you probably all know, there is no official language in the United States. The explicit policy is the dominance of English. The implicit policy is the dominance of English, with, and if one looks at the government websites, an increasing use of Spanish. You know, you go to the US Bureau of the Census, look some data, and Espanol. It's like there at the corner, you know, and more. So there's always a language policy. So, background for Canada and Quebec, because we'll talk about both set of language policy. There's a national federal language policy, and there's a Quebec language policy, and they're not coordinated. Canada has 31 million people, official number in 2006, a bit more now, 32 million. 18 million Anglophones, 7 million Francophones, and 6 million what we call allophones, other languages. Most important one is Chinese, 1 million Chinese, 500,000 Italians, and German, each of those groups, in terms of mother tongue. So these are mother tongue groups. So Quebec's population is the order of 7.58 million people, okay? Tend to be conservative in my numbers, 6 million Francophones, and the rest are Anglophones and allophones. So Italian, Spanish, and Arabic, about 100,000 each. And the key point, very different from Catalonia, is that there are 4 million unilingual French-speaking people in Quebec. They don't speak English. at all. Using the census question, can you carry out a conversation in? Which is not a very demanding question. If you actually thought of, could they move tomorrow and work in English in America? It's more like 5 million unilinguals. There's an extra million there that can do some English, but that could not work in English. So we probably have 1 million individuals that can move between labor markets. MDs can understand some English and can serve some English patients, but if you put them in an English-speaking environment, most Francophone MDs would not be able to do it. You know, the occasional English patient who has some French, yeah, but. And there's about 3.3 million, 300,000 Francophones in New Brunswick and 500,000 Francophones in Ontario. So we had those 7 million Francophones. We put 6 million in Quebec. We have 800,000 in 2 other provinces, and the rest are scattered throughout the country. 10,000 here, 20,000 there, and so forth. And the history of how Francophones can be there was the 1763 British conquest of Nouvelle-France. And the British Crown grants rights, religion, civil law, language in 1774. And they don't do it because they like Francophones. They do it because the American Revolution is coming. So they want a solid base of support for the Crown in North America. And they buy, literally they buy the loyalty of the French-speaking elite and its population, agree not to rebel against the Crown, which they don't. They will fight the Americans. And a small point that most people don't know, if you look at the first version of the American Constitution, Quebec was allowed to join. It could have been the 14th colony that joined America. After we fought them, they removed that from the final version of the Constitution. Stable until 1840, there's a Francophone rebellion in 1838, 1839. And so what were 2 separate provinces are merged into one. A unitary state fails. So within 25 years, the Anglophones say, okay, unitarism does not work in Canada. We're going to, again, go back to what we had. It was called Lower Canada for Quebec, Upper Canada for Ontario. And we go back to the federal state with education and provincial responsibility, like for the autonomous communities in Spain. And from 1867 until 1960, the Francophones in Quebec, it's a priest-ridden, Catholic, high birth rate province. So we don't get wiped out because we believe the priests and we have families of 14 children and 12 children and things like that. And some of them moved to the United States because we exhaust the land. By 1870, 1880, the good arable land, which is along the St. Lawrence River, not at most countries in the world, the main waterway is where the good arable land is because it was flooded in the past, is more or less exhausted, and some people will move to less productive land, and some people will move to factories in the US. And until 1920, the US-Canadian border, it's 27 to be strict, the US-Canadian border doesn't exist, completely open, you just move across. My wife's father was born in the US because his father, my wife's grandfather, was a stonemason, and he happened to be building a cathedral in the US that time. So he was born there, and he came back to Canada. And it only mattered when he applied for his old age pension at age 65, and people said, but you were born in the US. Yeah, but I've been a Canadian all my life. Okay, but at that time it was very fluid. Now it's no longer the case. And so, where the language policy, that was the background, the language policy come from? Quebec has what's called a quiet revolution, a révolution tranquille, a new de facto federal, and the French Canadian, which was the way that we were known. I mean, the original name of Canadian went with the Francophone group. When the Anglophone group, we sort of scratched our head and called ourselves French Canadians, and then we switched to Québécois around the 1970. The most common appellation will be Québécois. And the language policy started in 1969, the explicit one. It's strictly not true. There's an attempt in 1938, but it doesn't go through the House. And there's a very, very minor law in 1917 on the language of train tickets. I think we can leave that one aside, okay? That one at the end. So, by the mid-1960s, the Francophones are waking up to the fact that they're poor, their birth rate has dropped, and the immigrants are going to English language schools. What do we do? Well, interestingly enough, that first law, Bill 63, 1969, gives freedom of choice in schooling. So it is not at all the coercive language law. It makes it very clear, because what happened is the organization of primary and secondary schooling is decentralized below the provincial level at what's called a school board level. And the school board, some school boards would refuse access to English language schools to immigrants. So there were riots by Italian immigrants in Saint Leonard in 1968, all sorts of going on. The first law was freedom of choice. The government who introduced that in 69 was defeated in 70. I won't say only because of that, it did not help. The second language law is called Bill 22, it's 1974. It's got some restrictions, but it's an extremely difficult law to implement, because access to English language school at the entrance to the primary level is to be based on testing. So we'll have every child, age 5, tested. If you can show the child speaks English, then he or she has access to the school, otherwise no. And there was an end-of-year show at that time called Bye Bye, whatever the year was, and they had this wonderful spoof on that. I still remember 40 years later, where this kid is being tested, and it's a girl, because Dominique Michel's the actress, and the girl speaks in Québécois joual, so we're full of English words, and so the mom says, oh, no, you know she speaks, oh no, she doesn't speak English, she speaks French like any Québécois. It's full of English words. So it was so Bill 101 was introduced by the Parti Québécois, which took power in November '76. Parti Québécois is a secessionist party in Quebec. It takes power having promised a referendum and having promised a language law. And the first language law, actually, the original numbering of Bill 101 is Bill 1. That's the symbolics. But they had to withdraw it, so it became Bill 101 for symbolics. The one had to be there somehow, so they found a way. And that's when I began working as a consultant for the government, because I ended up working as the economic advisor on that law. And there's a constitutional change in 2002 that brings constraints. We'll come back to that in a while. So, why do we do this? The drop in birth rate, the fear of assimilation, the poor economic status, mean income, okay? It leads to Bill 101. And what's in Bill 101? The key issue is schooling requirements for francophones and immigrants. And so the criterion of access to English language school in Bill 101 is having attended, one of the parents having attended an English language school in Quebec. That will be changed in 1984 to one of the parents having attended an English language school in Canada. Okay? So this is a very restrictive criterion. Most francophones would not have attended an English language school when they were kids, which meant that their kids could not go. So what people fail to realize often is Bill 101 is most constraining on the francophones. Why? Because before 1960, if you were a good Catholic, you went to French language school. Because there was a saying going back to 1860 by Monseigneur Laflèche, in French, qui perd sa langue perd sa foi, he who loses her or his language loses her or his faith. And losing your faith meant you became a Protestant. If you didn't become an atheist, that wasn't conceivable. It meant you switched over. If you became a Protestant, you went straight to hell. So that was it. So nobody wanted to lose their language because they didn't want to lose their faith and go straight to hell. You can actually show, I did it for a student once, you can actually show that it's true. The statement is empirical foundation. If you look at switches from ethnic French Canadians switching mother tongue, and then mother tongue switches to language, you see the percentages are correlated 0.8 or 0.9, and they're in the right order. The percent, the drop in from language, the mother tongue switch happens before the language. And we did that using, I think it was 1941 census data for 40 Canadian cities. Actually, I was just curious, could you validate the idea? The good bishop was right, and he was a sociologist at heart, or something, a sociolinguist. There's a big thing on language of signs. It prohibits the use of anything but French on outside and inside signs, except for English language institutions like the English Language School Board, where English is allowed. But a store, according to Bill 101, cannot say clothing, they must say vêtements. A language of work, it imposes, and we'll mention the recent changes, but that's interesting, but Bill 101 imposes requirement on businesses greater than 100 employees, and particularly greater than 500. So large businesses will have to use more French. A Francization process, to be distinguished from a Francophonization process. So it's a language aim, not an ethnic aim. Of course, there's a correlation, but if anybody who speaks good French can have the job. Now, did it work? Well, in 1970, 20% of allophone children went to French schools. By 2005, it stabilized to 80% going to French school. Why not 100? Well, because some have parents who've been to English school in Canada, so it doesn't, you'll never converge to 100. It may be 82 now, okay, but it gives you an idea that it's switched the system completely. The demolinguistic impact of Bill 101 is undeniable and very strong and visible in the streets of Montreal. Language assigned, as I said, French only, 1993, to more French. It was a Supreme Court judgment of 1988, which was resisted and then accepted when the Anglophone minority went to the UN. So predominant French is supposed to mean about 2 to 1. So it's a bit silly. What happens at the federal level and the rest of Canada? Well, the 1867 has some religious protection, but nothing about language, except in Quebec. So what happens in 1867 is as we break up this united country, a majority English-speaking country, to 2 provinces, would be a majority French-speaking in Quebec, the people in Ontario say, oh, we're leaving our kith and kin in Quebec at the mercy of these popist French-speaking people. Oh my God, better give them some protection. So there's asymmetry in the treatment of Quebec in the sense that the Anglophone minority in Quebec has much more power than the Francophone minorities outside Quebec. That's the asymmetry that comes from the Constitution of 1867. That will eventually go away through various things, too long a story to tell here. But by 1969, Canada introduces the Official Languages Act. So you can see that the action of the 2 governments in the language policy field occur more or less at the same time, 1969, 1977. So in a 10-year period, we'll go from a fairly unregulated environment to a double layer of regulation, federal and provincial in Quebec. And New Brunswick will become bilingual in 1969 also, and legally in the Constitution of 1992. So we have a lot of changes happening in the last third of the 20th century in terms of language policy in Canada. The Official Language Act was in 1988. In 1982, there's constitutional protection of minority language education. Where number warrants, it shall be offered. And Ontario will offer French services, while New Brunswick will become bilingual officially. Ontario has always refused to declare itself bilingual, but has always offered important language services in French. While New Brunswick became officially bilingual in '69, in 1992, enshrined that in the Constitution. Therefore, many of the politicians cannot undo it without the agreement of the federal government, because there was a English first provincial party running in one election. And the fear was that the language policy in New Brunswick would become a wedge issue. So the easiest way to kill it was to make it constitutionally protected, because then for a constitutional amendment of that nature, you would need at least the approval of the federal government. Some would argue other provinces, I'm not a lawyer, at least, so the Fed just have to say no. And that killed the issue. It was interesting use of the constitutional protection because the issue has never come back in 20 years. No party has campaigned since then on this issue of bilingualism in New Brunswick. So, overall, my last line says, Canada more bilingual, Quebec more French. That's the overall result of 2 parallel processes in the same time frame of language policy. Quebec tries to do away with the presence of English, and Canada tries to increase the presence of French. So, Any questions on the Canadian framework before we switch to economics?
ROC, what does it mean, this acronym?
Sorry?
You use it in this one at the beginning, ROC.
Oh, rest of Canada.
Ah, rest of Canada, of course, I'm sorry.
Actually, no, it's actually interesting. In Canadian social science, we use capital letters. In Scotland, it's RUK, rest of the United Kingdom, with a little r. So I don't know. It's actually intriguing. I don't know why we use one or the other, but rock sounds like something solid, right? So what happened is when Quebec began talking about separation, the rest of Canada sort of said, what do we call ourselves? And we can't really call ourselves Canada because that gets very confusing because Quebec is gone. So we could call ourselves New Canada, perhaps. And that sounds a bit strange.
US.
Well, no. So rock actually is a term that not the Francophones have created, but that the Anglophones have created. We would not dare make up a name for them. They made up the name, and that's what people use in English Canada. On the comment on the US, I'd like to remind you that fundamentally Canada is a country of losers. Okay? The Aboriginal lost to the French lost to the British Army, and the English that are in Canada are the losers of the American Independence War. Because those that wanted to remain under the Crown moved to Canada. So they were the losers. They did not accept the result. And in some cases that fought for the Crown. And so there was some uncertainty of staying behind if you fought on the wrong side. So Canada is a summation of losers, fundamentally, contrary to the US. And so it's much less true now, but if you go back about 30 years ago, some English Canadians defined themselves as non-Americans. So how do we distinguish ourselves from Americans? Insofar as we watch the same TV shows and look at the same movies and everything, how are we distinct? This will always remain an issue for English Canada. There's a strong tendency to look south for obvious reasons of cultural flows and individual flows. Yet, there's a strong revulsion at some aspects of American politics. So how do you define yourself? I'm not a sociologist, so all I can tell you that is something which you observe in the literature, and now you solve it is beyond what an economist can tell you, but you can simply know it exists. So how do economists address issues of language? Well, some think of language as a currency, a means of exchange, a store of value, store of knowledge. But most economists examine language as an individual attribute. And it's either ethnic, a bit like race. And the American gentleman who developed that was Becker. It could be seen as human capital, a bit like education. The key proponent of that is Mincer. And the only thing I did that was useful in my thesis was to say, well, it's both. Because the mother tongue is obviously an ethnic marker, there's no doubt about that. I mean, you're Catalan and you're not Catalan in Catalonia, you're Quebecois, you're not Quebecois in Quebec. It's also human capital. Most other languages that you learn are human capital. They don't tend to be an ethnic marker. There are some cases of assimilation and so forth, but no, for 98% of the population, I learned English, I speak English reasonably well, but it doesn't make me an Anglophone. It makes me a Quebecois who speaks English reasonably well and can use it all over the world. That's quite different. That's human capital. Allows us to communicate. It's allowed me to make lots of money working for the World Bank all over the world. But it still hasn't transformed my ethnicity. So there's two aspects to language. And Professor Gray has actually expanded a lot on this, on market, non-market, private, social issues. We don't get into, they're not operational as such. Now, what has impacted the most on language policy is the issue of language of work and limits. Now, what determines the language of work, ownership of the business, the language of sales and purchases, and the technology used, the three drivers. Okay? If you have a small business and the owner is Catalan speaking, I presume in Catalonia, the owner expects he or she to speak Catalan to the workers, and the workers will expect to speak Catalan to the owner. If the owner is Castellan, well, maybe more likely to speak Castellan. Of course, if the owner is Castellan in an area where there are nobody else who speaks Castellan, the owner may end up speaking Catalan because no choice available. Same thing happens in Quebec. You run mines in northern Quebec where you only have francophones to work with. Well, the owner, even the owner is English speaking, the owner is going to have to speak French because the workers will look at the owner and say, what do you want? So clearly there's an issue of ownership, technology use, language of sales, and the question is really the impact on earnings. The big debate, as I said earlier, there were two issues, are we poor or are we disappearing? The disappearing part is the language of schooling. That has slowed down the assimilation of allophones into the Anglophone community. It hasn't made it go away, but it has slowed it down because all the immigrants now go to French language schools. So they're exposed to French language culture to the age of 17, from the age of 5. So they know French. They may choose not to use it later, but there's no argument that they haven't been exposed to it. But on the earnings, it's the kind of things that economists worry about. The kind of stuff we can look at are both mean earnings and gross earnings. So in I put up the most recent numbers are 2005. The last time I was here was 2000. The numbers for 2010 are coming out now, but they haven't analyzed yet. So this was finished last year, the 2005 analysis. So we've got the new ones. This is the ratio of unilingual Anglophone men in 1970 earned 59% more, 1.59, than unilingual Francophone men. And by 2005, they earned 25% more. So the ratio has dropped by half. Same thing for bilingual Anglophone, sorry. The ratio has pretty much dropped by half. In bilingual Francophone, the ratio has dropped a bit. So there's convergence between the earnings. I could have put up allophones also, but it just makes a very big illegible table. So I put, these are 80%, 90% of the population of Quebec. So we've got most of the story. The allophone issue is that the origins of migrant changes over time, and therefore you don't know if it's an impact of language scales or an impact of the origin of migrant change that impacts on the earnings differentiation when you put up those numbers. So it's more difficult to account correctly for language. But this is just mean earnings, okay? Now, this is women, okay? 1.2405, 1.28, 1.2. But you can see actually that bilingual Francophone women are doing much better relative to bilingual Francophone women in 2005. It was 1.24, it's 1.33. So they've actually increased. So the returns to bilingualism appear to have increased. But the question that we face when we see many earnings like that, well, yeah, but you know, one thing that happened between 1970 and 2005 is that Francophones became much more schooled than they were. Back in the 60s, Francophones were very little schooling. Going halfway through high school was seen as quite good. So grade 9 years of high school schooling. For all sorts of reasons, okay? Ownership of businesses by Anglophones make it uninteresting to earn. As in, why would I need this anyway? I can go work in the bush and chop down some wood and make some money and so forth and so on. By 2005, Francophones are roughly at school. There's still a stock effect. The older Anglophones are better at school, but the younger generation just goes on to school as much as the Anglophones fundamental. A few percentage point differences. So I don't know what's happening if I look at the mean earnings. So the big thing that economists like to do is look at the net impact on earnings. So we run multivariate analysis, we put earnings as a dependent variable, and we put language scales, and then we put control variables. So this one is done with educational skills, years of experience, and weeks work. You'll have to trust me. I can tell you I can add occupation, I can add industry, I can add marital status, ethnicity, internal migration, external migration, and those numbers will remain unchanged, plus or minus 2. So the -8 can vary between -10 and -6. But the fundamental changes remain unchanged. I do it every time I run the basic number, I run the other ones just to make sure. It's like a standard 101 approach, and I didn't put them up on this one. But what we see, a major change, okay, for men. plus 10 to minus 8. It's an 18 percentage point change over 35 years. Anglophone men are now, in terms of the returns to language attribute, disadvantaged compared to unilingual francophones. This is the comparison point. Same thing, bilingual anglophones are no longer advantaged, the men. And the bilingualism of francophone has dropped from roughly 12.6 to 4.8. But remember we showed just before the women actually had improved there in the gross earnings. We get the same result here, from 9.7 to roughly 14. Here, women, there was no impact of language either in 1970 or 2005 once you controlled for education and so forth. There's two reasons for that. One of them is women suffer discrimination in the labor force. Okay, that's quite clear. I've looked at that in other studies. It's just no point arguing about it. It's true. But the consequence of that is that if your earnings are always lower for women, in a sense, there's no more room for variation for language. If you've got a large range of earnings and language can play a role, if you're compressed down, then it's just difficult for language to play a role. It's got no room in a sense. And the other thing that happens for the two groups of anglophones is that a subset of them, not all of them, but a subset of them have come to Quebec following their husband's career as, there was Alcan, the aluminum company, for example, a policy of having people rotate through the head office in Montreal. And they're often, proportionally speaking, more often trained in caring profession, education and health. Okay, that's a fact of life. Okay, if you look at the statistics in the census, it's not a judgment. And education and health, you will need to know French to work in Quebec. So you can be a vice president, operations, Alcan in Quebec and not know French. But that's most likely an engineering, man-dominated occupation. But you can't really be a nurse in an hospital and not know French. So it's more, so language, it's much more difficult to, they didn't lose much, but they got to job that probably self-segregated already, without language being too important. So they will be working in some subset of the language market.
Excuse me,
yes,
for a second.
Of course.
Yeah, you mentioned a comparison with unilingual francophones, but I didn't see them on the.
That's the reference point. This is with respect to unilingual. Okay. How did things change with respect to unilingual francophone? So the big thing is that my unilingual anglophones were 10 percentage points ahead and now minus 8 for the men. The biggest change are the men anglophones, 70 to 2008, changed roughly both by 17, 18 percentage points. So your market has changed substantially. Is this caused by the language law? A tiny bit, perhaps. The big thing that happened is the Parti Québécois took power and scared the anglophones away from Quebec. So it scared away some who were there and made the big thing that we cannot estimate, made it that some people did not come. Now in economics, if you have data on behavior, you can try to explain it. But if you have unobserved behavior that did not happen, you don't have data on it. People did not come. Yes, it's true, but how do I know who would have come if something else had not happened? I can't find that out. But I'm convinced that's one of the explanations. The growth of various head offices with anglophones just didn't happen. So those that there left slowly, not much. But those that don't come, the cumulative effect over 20 years. This switch over happens by 1985. You get about the same result as 2005. It's quite stable afterwards. I've got the data for every 5 years, but I mean, it fluctuates a bit because you get some sample. The census is not it's a subset of the samples. There's a bit of sample variation, but so shifts in earnings, so increased supply of French speakers. There should be a drop in return, but increased demand for French speakers, out migration, and reduced influence. What I just said. Now, one thing just to mention. On the ownership of employers in Quebec, the tall line, the white line, is the share of jobs in francophone-owned businesses. It was 47% in 1961. It is 67% in 2003. That's a 20 percentage point increase 20 over 47 is not quite 50% change, but a good 40% change. So what happened, what drove fundamentally what we see is that you have a lot more owners of business who are French speakers, and they expect to work in French. And so your returns to French. I mean, if your language is of greater use, it's going to get greater value. Just rather trite observation, but that's good. Yes?
But just a question. How did you get this data about ownership? It's difficult. Where is the economic power?
So,
I imagine in my country it's no easy.
Yeah.
Who controls the businesses?
The 1961 study was done by an economist called André Reynaud for the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. The 78, 91, and 2003 were done by your humble servant, with André Reynaud the first time, who taught me how to do it, and by myself. Actually, the last one I did it with my son. Worked with my research assistant, working, spent a whole summer coding. We are, in all cases, what we did, the data source varied, okay, but fundamentally, in all cases, we had a list of thousands of businesses. And when I say thousand, I think the last one is 8,000 businesses. We had a sampling strategy where every business above 100 employees was there, so 100% coverage of large business. And then a sampling strategy that varied with a number of businesses by sector. Okay? For each business, we had access to foreign or Canadian ownership through Statistics Canada coding. It's called CALURA, Corporations and Labor Union Returns Act. It's a requirement of the 1960s because there was fear of American hegemony in that time, okay? So that was brought in then. That requires every business to trace to its ultimate owner if they're owned by Canadians or by foreigners. So you can have a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a subsidiary that can still tell you who the ultimate owner is. So that's produced by Statistics Canada. When these were books, because they no longer both are CD, they were that big, and you flip through them in alphabetical order. And there was this wonderful cross in there. The chap who did the 78 study, I mean, he lived in his office for 6 months covered in paper, okay, like what you do like or something. Now we have access to databases online, so it's easier, but the same idea is there. And then for the Canadian owned, we have, again, ultimate ownership, and we have the composition of the board. And you can see if the board is French-speaking or English-speaking. People tell me, oh, this must be terrible. In all my studies, I have found one tie where it was the same number of Francophone and Anglophone. And for any large business, I can tell you, okay, if I see Pomerleau, I know who Pomerleau is. If I see the Grup de Complexitat, I know who owns. So all the large business, I've been around for 40 years as an economist. I say, yeah. So the PUM business was bought by Multimac. And Mrs. Harrison, who was the widow of the owner of PUM business, because it was a bread-making business, had the remaining Anglophone seat on the board, and the rest were all owners of the Durivage, of Multimac, I think it was the Durivage family. So, but we did that business by business by business. Every single business was checked. And what I always say for the 2003 study, I said my son, my eldest boy is a co-author, and my youngest boy also worked on it. They were both slaves for the summer. And the youngest one did the smaller businesses. So I figure there, it didn't matter. And we came up with the fact that small, medium, so 10 to 20 employee fishing businesses were Anglophone majority owned. And I said to him, Alain, this cannot be true. You made a coding error. He says, no, I didn't make a coding error. I went back and I checked. And it was the classic, 19 times out of 20 your sample is correct and the 20th time is wrong, right? Well, it was a classic one. We had randomly selected the business and we had randomly picked that one Anglophone owned of all. So we did a correction. But then we went back in the list and oh, this is not representative, but we had a rule for picking and which tells me that the system works because you could make mistakes that were systematic. So that's how we figure out who owns what. Language of the mother tongue of the board of the company, and we can of the ultimate owner. So if it's an American business that owns you and has a mother tongue board in Quebec, we still won't call you French. We're going to say, no, you're owned in the USA. This is English-speaking Florida. That's it. Not difficult. But it's, last one I think is 7 person months of work of 3 people to do that plus my supervision. Quebec government has not wanted to update it since then. I believe this thing should be done roughly every 7 years or so. I don't think it should be done every year. Things don't change very fast. But if you, look, if you ask me my best guess, are those numbers still valid? Yeah, because there's been a drop in the presence of foreign mining businesses and no major closure of francophone businesses. But when Walmart came into Quebec, that showed directly in the statistical index we put together. The retail sector became more foreign-owned, which I've never done before. Boom, you can see Walmart's, okay, Walmart's there, yeah, and the numbers showed it. And industrial structure explains some changes. The example I like to give is in 1961, people walked to rural schools wearing shoes made in Montreal by businesses owned by Anglophones. Brown Shoe Company. By 1978, people were driven by school bus to semi-urban schools. And if you look at the school bus industry, it did not exist in 1961. End of discussion. There was no school bus. I mean, you just walked to school. There was 1,000. And when you look at the school bus industry, it's entirely francophone home. Because the Anglophones are in city where they take the city bus. There's almost no school bus. I exaggerate slightly, almost no school bus. And then you see the emergence of a, well, inter-regional, inter-provincial, some francophone business based on the school bus, but they buy some nicer buses to take the older people on pilgrimage and stuff like that. So anyway, that's how we do it. It's fun, it's long. I like to do it once more before I die, and, but I don't make up to it. So, the policies. You should distingush mandated choosing bilingualism, setup costs and ongoing costs, and public and private costs. That's not even really brilliant to say. And at the federal government, total cost of bilingualism in 2005-2006. We used the last census available when I did the study, so I wanted to be able to match the census, was $1.7, $1.8 billion. It's about $1.40 per euro, to allow you to put that in euro terms. And it was 0.15% of gross domestic product in Canada. You can have the PowerPoint afterwards. So, how did we do that? Well, it's translation. We went to the public accounts. We, and a student called Olivier Koch, we went to the public accounts and we found more or less various items. Some of them are quite explicit. Some of them, the key issue to my mind, the key message, that you should never say that the minority language cost is the cost of a policy. It's really the per capita minority observed spending minus the per capita majority observed spending times the minority population gives you the cost. So if it costs you 1,100 per capita and 1,000 per capita for the majority, the minority language policy cost is $100 per person times the number of people served. People will say Radio-Canada, which is French Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, costs $600 million. This is terrible. Well, no. If you did not have Radio-Canada, you would presumably have English language CBC in Quebec providing local news and reporting on the National Assembly and whatnot. And so you look at the cost of covering the rest of Canada and say, well, you know, on a per capita basis, I'm assuming some marginal cost equal average cost, which is probably right because you need so many reporters to cover so many news events. It would probably cost me, I don't know, $450 million. So if it was $600 million minus $450, the real cost of having my language is $150. You must not attribute the entire operational cost, but just a differential. And I give CBC, Radio-Canada, as an example because that was an easy one, but it's not that difficult for many institutions to find the differentiation. It's all in the public accounts. You simply have to sit down, extract the numbers, take the population served, and make the calculation. And that way you don't get this. The funny part about this study was funded by an anti-French body. They didn't quite get the result they expected, but they were extremely correct in no interference at all with their results. So, you've got you've got a policy to provide services to a minority language group. What are the benefits? Wow, psychic benefits. I'm an economist, I can't figure those out. Language industry, people tell me, well, it creates jobs for translators. Well, that's not really a very good argument. I mean, if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have those jobs, so what? I mean, more exports to French markets, goods, services. Well, no, not really, because at least at the federal level, it's got nothing to do with it. What explains why Bombardier sells locomotive in French Africa is because we have French language workers in Bombardier. It's got nothing to do with the fact that you can be served in French in an airport. You know, you've got to attribute the benefits to what. What I think we should be forthcoming about this is the value of services to minority. Somebody who's, my 4 million unilingual French speakers in Quebec, they derive benefits from being able to listen to debates of Parliament in French. They derive benefits from watching Radio Canada in French. So, how do I establish the value of that? Well, I've got to make a couple of decisions. I've got 4 million unilingual francophones and 6 million francophones in Quebec. Leave aside those outside Quebec for a moment, okay? Just have to change the numbers, you get the same results. Are services in French aimed at unilinguals or bilinguals? Well, the bilinguals could use the English, but they probably still derive some benefits from doing it in French. So you're sure about your unilingual being the minimum demand for service in French. If you add the bilingual as unilingual, that's the maximum demand, and in between, you've got the true demand. And the value will depend on the extent of interaction with government. And how would you get the value? Well, I figure if there was no official languages act, and I have to file my income tax return, I'm unilingual francophone. What could I do? Well, maybe I'd find a nice civil servant at the Wicked who would help me, because that person also spoke French. And we say, maybe I have friends or family who will come with me and do it with me. Say, this is what you do. Or maybe I'll hire a paid translator. That's the three options I have, really. Okay? I don't know English. There's no Languages Act protecting me, so it's studied in English only, and I must interact with the federal government. So I've got to find a way to do it. My three options are that. Well, we did some evaluations, and it was between 6 and 800 million, the value of these services. So how do I do this? I assume so many hours of interaction. How much does the translator cost? This is what having the federal government offer it to me avoids a spending for me. So I avoid 800 million. That's what it's worth to me. And if I add the bilinguals, I assume the bilinguals have a demand half of the unilingual. That's an assumption. It's impossible to prove one way or another. I can get up to about 1.1 billion. So I add 1.7, 1.8, and here I get direct economic benefits of 1.1 billion. Now, if I add anything about psychic benefits or some impact on other markets, I'm not very far from what I'm spending. But the issue is, am I spending a bit more than the benefits? Is there some waste by the government? Or what is the symbolic benefit? If you assume that the symbolic benefit of being bilingual is worth $10 per Canadian, that gives you $330 million right there that you add up. But it was interesting, nobody had any idea about this before. It was interesting to say, no, they're not that far off. If I assume that bilingual francophones demand to be served in French as much as unilingual, I get a result much higher. So, as I say, we neglect symbolic, we neglect distributional issue, but we can calculate who pays or receives. And I just want to show you, that's more or less the last slide. That's lots of numbers, but let me just go to one number here. Okay. There's two kinds of services available from the federal government to francophones. What I call social service and general service. Social services, I want my old age pension. I want my unemployment insurance. I want my disability benefit. I need to interact and get money. That's more or less a one-off, intensive, important cost, then the check comes. Or I go through airport security 10 times a year, and every time I'm going to be served in French. That's a low intensity, 2 minutes as opposed to an hour, not too much of a consequence, but repeated interaction. And what we did, we calculated, this is for the transfers, and this is the general spending. We calculated per decile of income, okay, how much they spent. So, for example, it's perhaps not too surprising that this group is the highest in terms of transfer from the federal government. But this one is the one that consumes the most services. The 10th decile, the richest 10% of the population in this country, are most likely to fly, for example, and to use services provided by the federal government in airports. Less likely to use transfers. And we try to calculate what we call a self-financing ratio. So, why you get negative numbers because of the quirk of the income tax system in Canada. So don't forget about them. I don't want to explain the income tax system in Canada to you. But what is clear, those number goes up. It tells me that the self-financing ratio, okay, for francophones goes up, but even the richest only pay 72% of the cost of bilingual services that they consume. So one of the debates we have is often, what's the distribution of these services? Well, we use two kinds of data. I've had a very smart master's students who knew databases better than I do, and we mix the databases. We showed those in Venice at the conference in July. We're able to show that there was a possibility of finding out who pays for bilingual services. Provincial, municipal, the main cost driver is education, and so per capita cost will be higher for smaller groups. That's not surprising. And so the conclusions, language policies you should require but not ban, in my opinion. So the idea of banning other languages and sign was very dumb. I don't see any gains from that. Facilitate early learning of languages by immersion. Distinguish internal and external needs. And evaluate to choose well. That's a key for sociolinguistics. And if you look at Quebec, I look at history, the conquest reduced the value of French as human capital. Before the conquest, everything was in French. After the conquest, some of it was in English. The language policies try to increase the value of language, French language capital. That's the last slide. I think that in the case of Quebec, the big problem that we still have is that we don't like English because it's the language of conquest, but it's also the language of international use. So the last language policy in Quebec was introduced in December 2012, but debated in March 2000. That's why it's debated in March 2013. It's called Bill 14. It's an extension of Bill 101 to medium-sized businesses, 50, 99 employees. And it has not been adopted. I do not believe it will be adopted because the Parti Québécois is a minority government and the two other parties are against the policy. So I think it's going to die. Legislation put forward in the House can simply die, never be adopted, never voted on, and so never rejected, never adopted. It just sort of slides away into a tomb somehow. We don't quite know. I did some work for the Quebec government on that. I was asked to evaluate that policy. We had some fun because we were trying to establish how many businesses would be impacted by the policy. The first thing we discovered is nobody knew the exact number of businesses. We were given a number, but I really love this. We were given a number of the government, and then about a week later, the civil servants who worked said, oh, by the way, that number has no source. People we got it from won't confirm it. I said, okay, I'm supposed to evaluate the impact of policy on a subset of business whose number is unknown. So we went, found some, I'm using that data, we found some data and came up with a range. That was rather an interesting shock. You begin the policy work and you're told, well, we don't know how many are affected. And then we were able to find a survey done by Pierre Bouchard on l'Office québécois de la française a few years just before he retired. And finally, we were able to classify business into 3 groups. So what will make you, as a medium-sized business, more or less likely to have to change your practice if you become more French? Well, it's really the markets you serve and your ownership. 50% of the small business were French-owned, serving only Quebec. Well, they're probably using as much French as they can anyway. It's unlikely that going in there will make you say, oh my God, you got too much English in. 30% of the businesses, they're all 5099 employees, but we don't have to, I cannot tell you the number of employees affected, were French-owned, serving markets outside Quebec also. And 20% were non-French-owned, minority or English, serving markets outside Quebec. Fundamentally, you could break them down to 3 groups. So we made assumptions about the intensity of requirements to intensify your use of French. The small business group said, your numbers are too small, the government thought our numbers were too large, so they're probably okay. That's my first criterion. It already acted from both sides and probably reasonably close to the truth. But I cannot demonstrate that. But I think the numbers made sense. It was an interesting policy exercise, but it wasn't quite clear. They did the policy because they felt something had to be done. But the key issue remains, I mean, if you want small, innovative businesses, in a sense, you sort of say, let them be. Why would you put more bureaucracy as business just emerge and start growing? When they reach 5,000, they've got no problem. You have large economies of scale, so requiring one translator to be there to produce stuff in French is okay. When you've got 60 employees and you're competing with North American businesses, you probably use more English than what is, quote, desirable, but you create 60 jobs. So anyway, that's the last policy. To update you, the last policy in Quebec was Bill 14, not studied, not adopted. If you want the report, it's public, I can send it to you. It's in French, and that's the state of the art in Quebec. Questions, comments, whatever. Far away.
Conferència is the framework del 15 anys del CUSC. Quan insistim perquè ho diguis, justament, cap notícies vegades ja ho he dit. 15 years of our research center.
Yeah.
So you are also in this framework. So you should be happy, as we are. Okay, now you can ask whatever you like.
This gentleman and that gentleman, I believe, and that gentleman afterwards.
I was struck by this, one of the conclusions, it's a sort of advice. It's better to require languages than ban them.
Yeah.
Then thinking about that, if I am right, language policy in Quebec didn't banned the possibility to allophones to go to attend English-speaking schools. Is it right?
Right, correct.
Is it still this way?
If one of your parents has not attended school in English in Canada, you cannot attend school in English in Quebec. Which means that most immigrants do not have a parent that attended school, even though, I mean, the classical example, you come from the United Kingdom, both parents have attended school in English in the United Kingdom, the children must attend school in French in Quebec. That's quite correct.
But then it's a sort of banning them.
Oh yes.
Do you agree with that? Do you agree with this policy?
I personally,
it's a banning.
Yes, I've argued the following policy in the area of education in a different paper. I would mix and match all the Anglophones and the Francophones. I would send everybody to French language school at the beginning. Everybody, no exception, until grade 4. And then I would allow freedom, and I would require all Francophones to attend at least 1 year of immersion between grade 4 and grade 6. So early immersion in French, early French education for everybody, which means early immersion for the non-Francophones, and then medium immersion for Francophones. Why not early immersion for Francophones? Because it's going to be politically impossible to have that accepted, so I'm a practical person. And why I suggest doing it that way is that if everybody goes to French language school in the first, preschool in the first 3 year primary, this will free up English language teachers who will become idle, because some are going to English language school now, and these English language teachers could be used to immerse the Francophones in French. And then you would have, I mean, the Dutch, every Dutch person speaks English fundamentally, and yet it's more complicated to learn English for somebody in Holland and Quebec, or should be more. We are surrounded by English. To me, it's absurd that 60% of Francophones cannot speak English. To me, it's totally absurd. As an economist, it's a wasted opportunity to acquire useful human capital. So, yes, do I agree? Do I agree? Yes. I would, on the schooling, I'd be careful to make sure that everybody knows French. Okay? So it's a temporarily restricted ban, and then afterwards we have freedom. But what I have in mind there was also the language of sign. That to me is absurd.
The language of?
Not the signage, the language of shops. I mean, of course you should have French, but why would you ban Chinese or English or, I mean, whatever you want to put? If you want to put signs in 5 languages, as long as you've got French visible, I don't see what it adds to anybody's welfare, and I can see what it subtracts from somebody's welfare. So economists tend to want to be welfare maximizer. We like people to be better off if we can. We can't always, but if we can. And to my mind, taking away the right, say you're Chinese speaking in downtown Montreal and Chinatown, taking away the right to read in Chinese on the store what's in the store strikes me as absurd. It doesn't take away, I mean, as a Francophone, I'll never be able to read Chinese anyway. But it doesn't take, it doesn't take anything away from me to have the Chinese, as long as I can say, sure it's a pharmacy or something. I don't know. That's okay. But why make other people less happy? Yeah, that's Pareto optimization for economics.
Thank you.
Yes.
You discarded very rapidly the impact of creating or retaining part of the investment or the expenditures. When you were talking about the benefits of a language policy, which in fact was a language policy in favor of using French, in fact.
This one, right?
Yeah, language industry.
Okay, yeah.
And
like translation, interpretation, and so forth.
not only that, I mean, we probably have language industries and industries connected with language, or
yeah, so production of, say, French language channels or whatever. Yeah,
products, for instance, for television.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's say that if we have only English TV channels, all the money that would go to French-speaking soap operas would be spent buying American, US soap operas.
Perhaps making better English language Canadian soap operas.
But probably not in Quebec. That would be the point. Isn't that a way of forgetting one of an important impact of using the local language?
You're quite correct that as a consequence. To an economist, however, the fact that the French language movie producers would die away in Montreal, the English language movie producer in Vancouver, it's a distributional impact, but there's no efficiency loss. When we look at policy, we look at efficiency loss.
Yeah, but because we are talking about the national framework.
Yes, that's it. I'm an economist who's looking at the national official languages policy, not the Quebec one.
Yeah.
And the question was, what's the consequence for Canada as a whole? So the option for Canada as a whole is to get rid of French. And so the consequence would be either we would produce more or better English language, or we'd buy American. There are requirements on the production of TV hours. So presumably, if you did away with those in French, you have to translate it into English. I never been asked that question before. That's a good question. So we have 2 possibilities. I agree with you: buying American or improving Canadian. And yes, there would be unemployed French-speaking cinematographers. That's the consequence. You're quite correct. And to an economist, that doesn't matter. They'll find a job somewhere else. Markets adjust.
For an economist working for the Canadian government.
Yeah, from a Canadian, yes, from a Canadian government perspective.
No, I was thinking about the
Spanish
Spanish case where the fact of retaining the Basque language television and the Catalan language television has allowed local industries, cultural industries to stay here. While at the moment when private televisions were allowed only in Madrid, and all of them were, it was a political decision, all of them were created in Madrid, there was an exodus of actors, people working for publicity. I mean, publicity was based in Barcelona and it vanished and moved to Madrid.
Because of that policy decision on the structure of the industry.
Yeah, so obviously if we were to look at that from a NAFTA point of view, the distribution between Canada and the United States is great. No problem.
Exactly.
But for Canadians it will be a problem.
But I was doing this was for a Canadian perspective. You're quite right that from a Quebec perspective, cost-benefit analysis always depend on your borders. So you can show that an hotel built next to an airport is very much worthwhile from the municipality where the airport is located perspective, but from a larger perspective, you're just shifting demand for hotel rooms, and there's no gain. So it always depends which border you use. So here I'm using the Canadian perspective. You're quite correct.
I don't know if you have time for people.
Yeah, no problem.
The first one has to do with the symbolic benefit to the rest of Canada. That's to say the Canadian Anglophones of these policies. I'll give you an example. I'm an Ontario Anglophone, although I'm of more than 50% Acadian descent. I have a sister who's an Ontario Anglophone. She's married to a British Columbia Anglophone. They moved to Montreal. They send their children to French immersion in the English board, but French immersion. Now, why do they make that choice? Well, they know there are cognitive benefits. They know that it will be of a professional advantage to their children to speak good French. But it's also identitarian. That is, as Anglophone Canadians of a certain generation, they assume that French is part of their identity. And so it's good for their children to have that, internalized. A lot of Canadian Anglophones who think that way.
There are surveys by the Official Languages Commissioner which show about 2/3 of people like bilingualism, that being lower in Alberta, of all places, you won't be surprised, and being highest in New Brunswick, which won't be surprised either. Okay? The question is, for an economist, how do I put a number on that? So what I would have to do is, I would have to do a survey asking people, how much are you willing to pay for their various services? The Commissioner of Official Language has not done that, I suspect, because they're afraid of the answer. It comes out at $5 and you spend $50. I mean, the per capita spending is about $60 per person. Okay, those numbers in GDP term, they work out to about $60 per person, so about €45 per person per year in $2,005 for the official languages policy of the federal government. If they did a survey and they found it was 1/4 of that, that'd be a very big political problem. So they probably don't want to ask a question, and there's been no private survey to my knowledge.
I suppose it would have to do with how you couch the survey and the range of possible prices.
Yeah, exactly.
If you say, $1,000, $100, $50, $5.
But
people might choose 50.
But usually you ask people, here's what we do, how much is it worthwhile to you to preserve this natural reserve? And that's what this is. It's willingness to pay for surveys, WTP. It's done all over. In cost benefit, they do it all the time because a lot of benefits are not tangible. So we ask people, how much is this worth to you? And you're trying to establish a demand curve, in a sense. It's never been done to my knowledge. So a very good point. That's why I'm honest about it. And I said at the end, I don't want to abstigate. So if there's any psychic benefits of any significance, it swamps the rest. It's true. But as an economist, I go for what I can count and I can understand. So I've had the same question asked in Venice. Why do you give psychic benefits? I can't measure that. So, if you can give me some number or some data, I'll be quite happy to do it. But you're quite right.
The second question is rather more technical. You referred to English and the internationalization of the Quebec economy. I'm wondering specifically about knowledge workers. Let's say McGill wants to hire a new PhD from Princeton. I'm an American citizen, married to an American citizen. When they move to Montreal, are they given a period of grace during which they can send their children to English schools?
You have a 3-year...
I understand that's true for visiting purposes.
3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
What the other thing to do is to send them to private school, which is not subject to Bill 101. It'll cost you about €12,000 per year, I think.
Yeah.
I have to check. That's feasible also. There's quite a few English language schools in Westmount and East Western Montreal still there, offering private, unsubsidized education is not subject to the language requirements of Bill 101. That's the other option, which is often taken.
Yeah.
What used to be done is that you would send your kids to a private English language school for a couple of years, and that would give you the right to go to the public language school at no cost. So we have friends who are an MD and engineer from South Africa. They send their eldest boy 1 year to such a school at the cost of €10,000, and that granted the right to that boy and the 2 other kids So it was a high return investment. And that's one. Now there were court cases on that, there were laws passed on that, and there's a new law that sort of tries to say, well, you shouldn't do that, and we'll look at it case by case. And I suspect that whenever the case comes up, they'll go back to court and say that the law's not clear. And to be honest, it's not very clear. Nobody has been willing to say, it's everybody. I think you could say that private schools licensed by the government are subject to Bill 101. That's it. There's no problem doing that. That's legal. But they don't want to do that because they want a loophole for a temporary executive to come to Montreal for a few years. So they're sort of in between being coherent and incoherent, and the consequence is that you end up going to court all the time. So I'm unable to tell you what would happen next. I can tell you there have been various court decisions more or less generous to the rights of people on that. That's the most common.
Does the exception have to do with the fact that they're temporary, or the fact that they're academics research?
No, temporary. It's temporary. Academics as such are not. We don't unfortunately get that kind of treatment.
Yeah.
But we still have good salaries that are contrary.
Oh, I know, actually. Very, very good things, except McGill won't publish them.
No.
They don't make their salaries public.
No, we don't. Neither does the Université de Montreal, for that matter. And contrary to the United States, where often state universities publish salaries.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Oh, I did have a third, and it's sort of a related question. There are a number of jurisdictions in North America that are experimenting with dual language immersion education. Massachusetts, New York, California, Alberta, British Columbia, etc., whereby you would have, say, an English Cantonese, or an English Arabic, or an English Spanish bilingual school. 50% of the children would be the children of immigrants speaking that language. Some of the jurisdictions that won't look at this are Ontario and Quebec. Quebec could have, Arabic, French bilingual education, or Spanish-French bilingual education, because sociolinguistically it has enough highly trained Spanish speakers, Arabic speakers, etc., to do so. So what is it in Quebec education
Have you
policy?
followed the recent debate in Quebec last
The
week?
identitarian debate
Yeah,
about the Charter of Quebec Values.
That's it. That's the essence.
That's language. That's not something that you're wearing a turban.
Look. You're asking my
Yeah.
Quebec politician to show much more openness than they traditionally show. Language is settled, don't touch it, appears to be the motto. The question about McGill, we have a Quebec Charter of Value debate right now. How big can your cross be before we take it off your neck? Or can you wear a turban or a hijab or so forth and so on? It's rather silly. But have you seen the ad in the McGill Daily?
No, I haven't.
So there's a beautiful response from an economic perspective. It's a beautiful response. So we would ban the wearing of the veil by Muslim women. And this ad was run within 4 days in McGill Daily by some Ontario local health board. I think it's near Hamilton, if I remember correctly. It says, "We don't care what's on your head. We care what's in it. Come work with us." As an economist, I just thought this is the perfect market response to the issue. And actually, when people begin or ask questions, well, does it really matter to you that the Jewish doctor wears a kippah? Of course not, it doesn't matter. But that's what the law says. They wouldn't be allowed to wear it. And quite a few colleagues, I'm not practicing anything, but I'm tempted to wear something in my next lecture. Out of principle, what will they do if I wear a kippah and I'm not Jewish? So I wear a Jewish religious symbol, but I'm not Jewish. What do you do? It's a civil disobedience. Okay, yeah, you've got it. Really. Anyway, so the answer to that is that before we have intelligent policy, we have that intelligent debate on language, and it tends to be an issue where whenever somebody says something should be changed, somebody says, no, you'll take it away from me. So Bill 101, look, the funniest part in the Bill 14 debate was that in 77, Anglophones were against Bill 101, and now because Bill 14 was changing Bill 101, Anglophones were saying, ne touchez pas à la loi 101, don't touch Bill 101. And you're saying, wait a minute, when I was young, this is what you guys were saying. You said it the way around. So 25 years later, Anglophones are defending the linguistic status quo. So it's a very, so that's why I think that kind of stuff, look, nobody, the earliest English language immersion in Montreal is grade 6 for half a year. And that was a big thing to be done. And right now, with the Parti Québécois in power, expansion of that has been stopped, and studies are supposed to be made to examine if this is a terrible thing and so forth and so on. And can see the kind of debate we're going into. I have 2 boys. They're both fully bilingual. One of them went to McGill, the other one's doing a PhD in Anken in Finland. And what we did, we sent them to bilingual daycare. That wasn't regulated. So they went, which meant English speaking in my part of town. I lived in BG, Montreal. If you know Montreal, you know what that means. And then we sent them every summer to bilingual day camp, or English language day camp, to make sure they didn't lose it. And my test was very simple. When you go to see an original movie American, you wait for the French version or not. They did. They went to the original version. To me, that achieved it. But my mom taught English, okay? And back in the 60s, when nationalism was rising, she was once met parents who said, I am delighted to see my son is failing your course. So I don't want him to learn that language. Okay? This was in high school. So that gives you an intensity. Now, I don't think that would happen anymore, but this is like that really happened. She came back from a parent teacher, and I said, I met this really weird person. And we were, my household, my father did early immersion back in the 1930s by himself. He had 1 year of schooling, he had grade 9 mentioned, and he could go to school 1 more year before he had to go to work, because he was 14. He went to work at 15. He crossed the street. It's very brave in those days. He crossed the street and went to the English language Catholic school. So I mean, he could have lost his language, but the faith was okay. And he did a year in English. And that was the most worthwhile investment he did in terms of combination of education and language. But in those days, that wasn't done. I mean, you stayed to your side of the street, and you threw snowball on the other side of the street. You didn't cross it to learn. So imagine having gone to Protestant school, that would have been over with. So I just come from this bilingual environment, lived it by luck. Both my mom and dad were fluent. And so our kids, of course, was normal for us. My wife, you said you were Acadian, I'll tell you my wife is Brayon.
Yeah.
From Edmundston.
Yeah, my mother's family is Petitpart from Quebec.
From, okay.
Quebec.
Okay. So,
really
any other last questions?
I would like to ask a little bit about of the English competence problem. So now, right now, the government or the parliament, do they have any plans to change?
No, it was only the Bill 14 that was introduced.
Yeah, but Bill 14 was about the school too, or not?
No. Actually, Bill 14 at one point was supposed to, okay, the language requirements of Bill 101 are primary and secondary school. That takes you to age 17. We have something called CJEP, which are pre-university, which are 18 and 19. They were going to put that under the ambit of Bill 101. So they prevented Anglophones, allophones who have been to French language school at the primary and secondary level. About half of them stay in French language CJEPs and the other half go to English language CJEP. And they would have prevented that. But one of the 2 opposition parties said, if you do that to begin with, your law will lose for sure. So they decided in the end not to do it, although it was part of the Parti Québécois manifesto. That's correct. So it was discussed but not implemented.
Yeah, but I read in sometimes on the internet that there are some nervous, right? People are nervous about the English competence. People in middle class wanted the children to be more competent.
Oh yes,
right? So,
yeah, but that assumes intelligence on the part of the government to do that. That would be the late, not the late, but the not early, but the medium, so grade 4 to 6. This is the grade 6 immersion in English. They're here in English. So they teach in 5 months. They teach all the requirements of grade 6. The key grades are grade 1, 3, and 5. 2, 4, and 6 are like repeat grades if you want. So we know that by experience as parents. So you can sort of slack off a bit in grade 6 and have the smart kids go and learn English. Oh my God, they're going to become assimilated. If you're not willing to risk some look, if everybody knew English perfectly in Quebec, the rate of assimilation would surely go up. It's impossible to assume the other way around, okay? Because your intermarriage would go up a bit, okay? And so the odds would be. But your welfare would go up also. But if you're willing to constrain the welfare of people, your rate of assimilation won't be quite as high. But I'm not quite sure what you gain from that. So you're going to have 75% Francophone as opposed to 80%. And if the natural outcome over 500 years is for the French language society to disappear by choices of individuals, It's difficult to argue that you should prevent people from doing what they want. But that doesn't appear to be what people want to do. People are quite happy to maintain French, but they like to be able to know English to get better jobs. In the 1930s, there was a workers' Le Monde Ouvrier article, which I read in my thesis, which argued, this was a socialist, anti-clerical newspaper that argued for more English for the workers to free themselves from the church. That didn't work. Okay? But you can trace that kind of argument back to the 1930s. And it wasn't even the middle class, it was the lower class that saw that they were being constrained to a subset of North America and church control. Now church control is gone, but we're still constrained to a subset of North America. Slowly but surely it's eroding away as more and more people do like I did and just make sure the kids know English.
Just one comment about what you said. You assumed very clearly that assimilation will go in the direction of francophones becoming more anglophones.
Yes.
But that has only past empirical basis. You cannot predict what would happen if, let's say, you abolish all elements dividing the communities and say you are expected to share the same schools, the same institutions, and let's see what happens. That's not Canada, but to a certain extent that's what happens here.
My guess,
assimilation does not go in the direction of Castilian.
My guess what would happen is that people would move outside Quebec. That's why I assumed there'd be more assimilation. Mobility of francophones in North America is much lower than mobility of non-francophones for obvious reasons. It's about 1/10 from giving educational characteristics. Say it doubled, it became one half. Okay? More of them would move, some of them would find spouses in Illinois or North Dakota or wherever they would move to, and the likelihood of francophones maintaining friends that meet a non-francophone spouse outside of Quebec is low. Within Quebec, yes, I don't think the issue would be that. But so maybe I should have added the factor that makes me say that is the mobility. The greater North American mobility, and greater North American mobility is likely, in my opinion, to lead to greater intermarriage outside Quebec, and the survival of French outside Quebec is low. So over time, you'd have because of that, if some people leaving, you'd have a small drop. But I mean, maybe you'd get to 75% or something. I don't know. 80% is seen as a magical number, but there's no reason for that. Maybe 75 is acceptable. But you're quite correct, that within Quebec,
you're not taking into consideration the possibility of anglophones assimilating to francophones within Quebec because the borders are raised.
The data don't seem to show that happening a lot.
No, because it is impossible now.
Because some come to the plateau, some come to live, some but assimilating, having.
The thing is, if they share schools, they share hospitals, they share everything, and both are expected to learn
sharing everything would put to death the network of Anglophone institutions would be highly resisted by the Anglophones. So the Jewish General Hospital, which is an excellent hospital, or St. Mary, which is Catholic, are both Anglophone hospital. They can serve you in French, but they remain Anglophone hospitals. If you told the Anglophone community in Quebec, are you willing to put at risk those institutions for an exchange of better knowledge of English by francophones? I doubt they would say yes. They fought extremely hard against the mergers of municipalities and demerged as soon as they could in Montreal. They didn't want to give up language institutions. So they have school board, municipality, and hospitals. And I think that's a very interesting question. Where did the resistance come from? Maybe the Anglophones. I don't know.
But it happened in rural Quebec in the 19th century.
Yes.
That French-speaking Irish would intermarry and in a few generations be Francophone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they were much more of a minority. Okay. They're faith-dominated language. Why would they intermarry? Because they were Catholics. The idea of marrying a Protestant. I mean, you went to your father and said, to your bride, I can either marry this Catholic boy who's French-speaking or this Protestant boy who's English-speaking. What would your Irish father have said? I mean, take the Catholic boy anytime. Yeah. So that's probably relevant now, I think. But these are empirical questions. I mean, I'm an economist talking about demolinguistic assimilation over 100 years. I don't claim to know the answer to that. What we seem to expect is slow drop in the share of francophones.
What about the allophone, who
The
over time
allophone, the
come to identify
About
more as
half
French?
of them appear to become French, and the other half eventually leave Quebec after going to rather inexpensive university.
Yeah.
We have data that show there has never been, since 1962, a positive in-migration from the rest of Canada into Quebec. That's 50 years of out-migration. And the out-migration is by non-francophones, fundamentally. I'm not saying some francophones don't go, but the out-migration, I've done some empirical work on that, it's mainly by non-francophones who either came to Quebec to study and just fled back. So they come to McGill 4 years, they go. But we won't count those. But what you have are Quebec-born allophones and anglophones who actually speak French. They go to Concordia or McGill, and they say after that, look, I speak French, but not well enough to. Okay, I'm at 80% or 90%, but not 100% of what I would need for that kind of job. If I go to Calgary, I don't have to worry about it, and there my French may even be useful because I'll be, relatively speaking, a rarer quantity. So if they ever have to deal with Quebec in 2 years, they'll call on me, that may help me. So that's what the fundamental pattern is for about half the people. The other half are staying behind. I tell the story of the Jones family, which lived across the street from me. Megan went to school and went to immersion school. Went to school in high school in English. Went to English CGF on the South Shore. And went to law school in French in Sherbrooke. Almost failed her first year. Very tough on her. She's now practicing law in Quebec in French. As a boyfriend who's French speaking, and they live in Evan is doing accounting in Calgary. And we're waiting to see which way Graham, the third boy, will go. I'll have the answer to that one. I got 3 of them. It's a beautiful story because they're whole friends. They're the one who care for our house right now while we're in Europe. Okay, they're just a problem. We know them. We babysat and all that. And that's it. So that's Jones. That's a Welsh name. They're whole Quebec English. And that's now we know 2 of the results. And the third one, Graham, he's working with a TD Bank in Montreal. But his mother told me, yeah, it's considering to Toronto. There's more opportunities there. So, but the eldest, clearly, once you learn the French Quebec civil law system and got started on the law practice in Quebec, you're staying. So Megan Jones it may eventually become Megan Archambault, whatever it is, and that will disappear. Evan will never come back. He's going to start his accounting practice in Calgary. And Graham, we'll see.
Can you break it down in terms of the language of origin? If you're Chinese speaking, if you're Spanish speaking, etc., you're more likely to become francophone in 3 generations, or?
We don't know 3 generations because we only get your language, your mother tongue, and the language you use at home. So we do for 1 generation. We can get the kids, but not the 3rd one. I don't know the answer to that. Hope it was of some fun.
Okay, thank you.